Thank you. Anyone who sets out to explain the background that led to the outbreak of the First World War on August 1, 1914, very quickly realizes that the story created in 1919 with Article 231 of the Treaty of Versailles, namely the so-called Germany's sole guilt, was always just a myth. Article 231. The Allied and associated governments declare, and Germany acknowledges that Germany and its allies are responsible as the originators for all losses and damages, which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have suffered as a result of the war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and its allies. End of quote. With this so-called sole guilt article, the victors, namely France, tried to justify the conditions imposed on the German Reich and on the 28th of June 1919, which were signed under protest, to legally and morally legitimize the very harsh peace terms. Unfortunately, even today in Germany, you still find contemporaries who describe the path to the First World War in this way. England, France, and Russia were peaceful, amiable countries. But Germany under Kaiser Wilhelm was determined to start a war in order to conquer the world. Such statements should, to put it politely, simply be ignored. Because the path to the outbreak of a war is always, in general, the result of many small and large events, supported by unscrupulous propagandists from all countries, by deliberate or unintentional provocations, by economic and stock market interests, by insinuations and insults, and, in particular, the result of the alliances of opposing countries. Several foreign policy crises occurred during the reign of Wilhelm II, all of which had an impact on later developments. Keywords for this include 1896, the Kruger Telegram, 1900, the Hun Speech, 1904, the Russo-Japanese War, the Dogger Bank Incident until 1906, the Moroccan Crises, and finally, 1912. 1908, the Daily Telegraph Affair. Who still knows today that Wilhelm II, in November 1904, sent a message to the Russian Tsar, Nicholas II, had offered a defensive alliance, which the Russian government, however, opposed. Or Wilhelm's peace offensive in July 1905. He had, with the intention of rapprochement with Russia, which was on the verge of losing its war against Japan with Nicholas II, concluded the Friendship Treaty of Björkö, a Russian town on the Gulf of Finland. This defensive alliance was a mutual assistance pact, and France was supposed to be included in it. However, the treaty was already declared void by Russia in 1907 because the Tsarist Empire expected more from a partnership with France. Without digressing from the main topic, everyone please remember the time when there were still two military blocs in Europe, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, and the propaganda, whether from the East or the West, about who was the bad guy, or the deployments of the Bundeswehr in Yugoslavia as it was breaking up, or the understandable and persistent criticism of the so-called NATO eastward expansion that happened so quickly after 1990 under U.S. President Clinton. Anyone who deals with these questions will also find the sequence of events becomes clearer, and why there is never a single party to blame. The Americans sum it up with their saying, not
Ihrem Satz auf den Punkt.
Simply represented, Presidenten, after all, in 387 AD, reminds us of the phrase spoken by the Celtic leader Brennus, Vae Victis, in German, Wehe den Besiegten. At that time, Brennus is said to have accused the Romans during the ransom negotiations for the siege of the Roman capital of using false weights when weighing the gold. He then threw his heavy sword onto the scales with the words, "Woe to the vanquished," thereby significantly increasing the ransom amount within seconds. Because the victor has always influenced history, and he had his paid historians write or rewrite it as he pleased, always manipulatively and always to his advantage. After all, the victor also carefully chose the place and day of disgrace for the club. This was also the case on the 28th Seyfiu, June 28, 1919, the day the Treaty of Versailles, so bitter for Germany, was signed. Because the trigger for the First World War was an assassination that took place exactly 5 years earlier, on the 28th, June 1918 in Sarajevo. Also on this June 28th, an oppressively hot Sunday, the Serbs all across the country celebrated their national holiday, Vidovdan, also known as St. Vitus Day. The people remembered the 525th anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, where, back in the Middle Ages, the united Serbian princes were defeated and subjugated by the Turks. But in the evening, the assassination of the Austro-Hungarian heir to the throne and his wife brought the celebrations to an abrupt end. The 50-year-old Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie, née Kotek, had traveled to Bosnia, which had only been annexed by Austria in 1908, despite several warnings of assassination attempts. And in the capital of Bosnia, Sarajevo, they fell victim to a deadly attack. The revolver shots at the respected but little-loved princely couple were fired by the 20-year-old Gavrilo Princip, acting on behalf of the secret Greater Serbian militant organization, Black Hand, which, backed by the Belgrade government, fought against the existence of the Danube monarchy. After his arrest, Princip was sentenced to 20 years in prison at the end of October 1914. He died in April 1918 in the prison of Theresienstadt from tuberculosis. In Vienna, where for years the partly militant autonomy movements, which were responsible for numerous attacks or attempted attacks on Austrian officials or military personnel, had been observed with concern, they decided, quote, in view of the renewed serious challenge, to put an end to Serbian machinations now. But just in case, including the possibility of a war against Serbia, which could count on Russian support, the multi-ethnic state first tried to secure German assistance. The German emperor learned about their intentions on the 5th. On July 5th in Potsdam, through a personal letter from the Austro-Hungarian Emperor Franz Joseph, as well as from a memorandum of the Viennese government. Just 1 day later, Wilhelm II had the Viennese monarch answered by Chancellor von Bethmann Hollweg. His Majesty could also, between Austria-Hungary and this country,
Damit meinte Serbien,
remain neutral on current Austria-Hungary issues with this country, since they are beyond his competence. Emperor Franz Joseph can, however, rest assured that His Majesty, in accordance with his alliance obligations and his old friendship, will faithfully stand by the side of Austria-Hungary. End of quote. This German carte blanche for Austrian desires for revenge against Serbia was derived from the dual alliance concluded in 1879, which the diplomatically brilliant German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had achieved together with the Austrian Foreign Minister Gyula Andrassy. The treaty obligated that in the event of a Russian attack on one partner, the other would intervene with all its military forces in favor of the one under attack. And in the event of an attack by another foreign power on the partner, it at least required benevolent neutrality. Bismarck did not view the dual alliance as solely against Russia, but rather only as the centerpiece of a steadily expanding alliance system which he achieved in 1882 when Italy joined what was now called the Triple Alliance. Bismarck's successors, on the other hand, and this was the foreign policy weakness of Wilhelm II's administration, increasingly saw the dual alliance as the sole foundation of German foreign policy. However, by doing so, they created new alliance systems in Europe directed against Germany, which increasingly led to an unnatural dependence of the Reich on Austria. Thus, the loyal declaration of the German emperor to the Danube monarchy on the 6th July was only the logical consequence of the rigid and unimaginative foreign policy, even though Wilhelm II had, on the evening of the 5th July, was still relatively certain that there would not be any major European acts of war. After exchanging ideas with the Prussian Minister of War, Colonel General Erich von Falkenhayn, as well as with the Prussian chief of the General Staff, Colonel General Helmut von Moltke, who was in Carlsbad Spa, the Kaiser stated, quote, "The Tsar would not side with the prince's murderers, and besides, neither Russia nor France was ready for war." End of quote. Therefore, on July 6, he set out on the long-planned northern voyage with his yacht Hohenzollern, and Falkenhayn also began his vacation. Thus, the most important political and military figures of the German Empire were either abroad or on vacation. This circumstance should also be considered when considering the claim, unfortunately repeated like a mantra by many German historians, that Germany was, quote, "solely to blame," end quote, and had been intent on bringing about the war since early July. For that, at the very least, the presence of the three mentioned individuals in Berlin would have been necessary, because even Prussian generals at that time did not usually go on annual leave or to a health resort about 25 days before the actual outbreak of war, to issue their orders from there, as if by telepathic abilities. Quite the opposite seemed to be the case, because Berlin, in the first half of July, remained optimistically calm regarding a world crisis and saw only one possible danger: a military conflict between Austria-Hungary and Serbia. Therefore, the German High Seas Fleet also set out as planned on the 15th. In July, it began a maneuver and moved from its home ports of Kiel and Wilhelmshaven to Norwegian waters. However, the public and the press agreed that Germany did not need to fear a possible armed conflict. The German army had proven this in the last wars. But, as the ongoing developments proved, the proverbial Berlin composure was indeed justified, because secret dispatches from the German military attaché in Vienna to Berlin regularly stated that Austria-Hungary wanted to postpone the action against Serbia until after the harvest leave ended, after July 25th. These reports, which did not indicate any major war preparations by the alliance partner, also prompted Colonel General von Moltke to make the following comment, quote, "If the démarche doesn't happen until the 25th, if it takes place in July, a lot of water will still flow down the Danube before anything else happens." End of quote. However, already 2 days earlier than announced by the German military attaché, the Austrian ambassador in Belgrade, Vladimir Gieseler, Freie von Gieslingen, had on the 23rd of July presented an ultimatum that was as severe and unequivocal as possible and, in its wording, lacked any diplomatic restraint. Vienna accused the Serbian government of breaking its word and of involvement in crimes, and demanded an official condemnation of Greater Serbian propaganda, as well as the strict punishment of such efforts in the future. In addition, all associations directed against Austria-Hungary were to be dissolved, and those found complicit in the Sarajevo murder were to be arrested immediately. Finally, Vienna demanded the admission of a delegation onto Serbian soil to conduct further investigations and inquiries. Serbia was given 48 hours to comply with each demand. However, this led to a noticeable escalation of the situation, which went down in history as the so-called July Crisis. The note from Vienna was an ultimatum in the harshest diplomatic form and, despite the sender's legitimate concerns, was unacceptable to Belgrade for various reasons. Because just a few days after the attack on the 28th, by the end of June, the notoriously fickle world opinion, which so often judges by appearances without knowing the details, had taken the side of the, quote, poor, deeply humiliated, and pressured by its great neighbor Serbia, end quote, and had pushed aside the shots of Sarajevo. Belgrade, under the leadership of its radically conservative Prime Minister Nikola Pasic, quickly realized this unexpected support and made extensive use of these trends. The verbal support from Russia and France was gratefully received and appreciated. One might assume that Vienna was eagerly waiting for the ultimatum to be fulfilled, but the opposite was true. Because a rejection actually fit perfectly into the plan, since Austria wanted war with Serbia, in order to finally settle the score. Thoughts about a possible Russian intervention in favor of the Serbs were not even considered, even though it was well known that Russia supported the pan-Slavic movement. Similar motives to those of Wilhelm II probably played a dominant role here. However, Vienna did not seem to have been mistaken in its assessment of the small Balkan states' willingness to take risks, because 48 hours after receiving the démarche, Belgrade ordered on the 25th of July at 3 p.m. the general mobilization. With this, it signaled to Austria-Hungary its readiness for war. The Serbian call for help to St. Petersburg, the Russian capital, also did not go unanswered. The last paragraph of the generally moderate, though not restrained, telegram from Tsar Nicholas II filled the hawks in Belgrade with fresh courage. Indeed, the Tsar had written that, quote, "As long as there is the slightest hope of avoiding bloodshed, all our efforts must be directed toward this goal." But the Serbs could then also read further. "However, should our efforts here fail, despite all our sincerity and wishes, Your Royal Highness, meaning King Peter III of Serbia, can be assured that Russia will in no way remain indifferent to the fate of Serbia." End of quote. The Empire of Nicholas II, in turn, was confident of its French ally, with whom it had maintained the counterpart to the German-Austrian dual alliance since 1892, the so-called Franco-Russian alliance. In 1907, this was even expanded to the Triple Entente by the entry of Great Britain, so that now both groups of powers each had 3 alliance partners. The agreements within both blocs were also similar. Thus, the French and Russian partners had committed themselves that, in the event of an attack on one by a state of the so-called Central Powers, namely Germany, Austria, or Italy, they would deploy all available military forces against Germany. For Berlin, this dual alliance brought the unpleasant consequence of being immediately involved in a two-front war from the very beginning of any military conflict with France or Russia, which the political and military leadership in Germany viewed with mixed feelings for good reason. Because when the French and Russian war potential was combined, it created such an imbalance in favor of Germany's neighbors to the west and east, that the escalating and threatening situation in the Balkans since mid-July 1914 were now being viewed with growing concern. Suddenly, even the greatest optimists in Berlin realized that Russian intervention on behalf of Serbia would, through an uncontrollable chain reaction, inevitably lead to a European armed conflict sooner or later. This had previously been less taken into account in calculations, and hardly anyone truly wanted it to happen in their heart of hearts. But the political climate was steadily deteriorating, because 3 hours after mobilizing his army, Serbia's Prime Minister Pasic sent a response to Vienna's ultimatum that was, in form, extremely loyal and accommodating. But in terms of content, it was absolutely unsatisfactory for Austria. Vienna, which saw only a few of its ultimatum's demands fulfilled, immediately broke off all diplomatic relations with Serbia and, for its part, also gave the order on the 25th. On July 25th at 9:30 p.m., that is, 6.5 hours after Belgrade's general mobilization, it ordered the partial mobilization of 8 army corps, which corresponded to half of its armed forces. Most of these troops were intended for possible deployment against the, quote, defiant, end quote, Balkan state. The remaining 8 corps, especially those stationed on the Russian border, remained on a peacetime footing and were not affected by the mobilization in order not to provoke Russia. At that time, the Austro-Hungarian peacetime army numbered around 450,000 men. After the general mobilization ordered on the 31st, it increased to 1,396,000 soldiers. But despite the deployment of Serbian troops on one side and Austrian forces on the other, no shots had been fired yet. Now, at the last minute, The European leaders made diplomatic efforts to mediate and prevent the situation from exploding. Confidential messages reached Berlin warning of the imminent threat, reporting the first Russian mobilization preparations against Austria. In fact, Russia's foreign minister Sergei Zasanov and the chief of the general staff, Nikolai Nikolaevich Yanuskievich, had, on the 24th, agreed on a partial mobilization on July 24th. As these reports became more and more substantiated, Germany suddenly found itself in a political dilemma, not entirely without fault due to its half-hearted efforts to preserve the endangered peace. On the one hand, the majority of politicians genuinely wished to avoid a major war, although not, quote, at any price, end quote. On the other hand, the security situation of the central country in Europe, with its numerous neighbors, required certain military measures in preparation for a possible war, so that later on they would not have to face reproaches for unnecessary omissions. Therefore, the German General Staff, like those of the other involved nations, began making initial plans. But at the same time, Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg was still trying, just like his English and French counterparts, to achieve an amicable agreement between Vienna and St. Petersburg, but with little success. Additionally, military leaders were intensifying pressure on the governments of involved countries, seeking to take control of the state and Europe's future themselves. The generals on both sides watched every military move of their opposing neighbors with intense attention, ready to respond with appropriate measures of their own. They could easily provide reasons to justify their actions both externally and internally, which was of great importance to both sides. The chain reaction developed its own momentum. Germany, for example, reacted to the situation since the 26th. Germany, for example, reacted to the Russian mobilization preparations known since May 26th in such a way that Berlin's ambassador in St. Petersburg, Count Friedrich von Portales, pointed out the significance of a hostile act, whatever that might be. In such a case, he threatened the Russian Foreign Minister Sazonov with Germany's own mobilization of its armed forces. The German concern regarding Russian behavior did not seem entirely unfounded, because for some time now, the Berlin General Staff had become aware of an unusual mobilization variant of the Tsarist Empire, which was referred to as the so-called war preparation period. If Russia were actually to make use of this method, the General Staff concluded, then the Tsarist Empire would be able to discreetly prepare for mobilization through a whole range of measures, while outwardly continuing diplomatic negotiations. The final declaration of mobilization would therefore be a mere formality, because all time-consuming and organizationally complex measures would have already been completed. With this period of war preparations, the General Staff reasoned, however, this would give Russia a significant head start, which would immediately put the Central Powers in a militarily disadvantageous position between two overwhelming opponents in the East and the West. Because there was little doubt in Berlin that France, seizing the opportunity, would join in and try to make up for the defeat of 1871. In the meantime, Wilhelm II had recognized the seriousness of the situation and ended his trip to the north on July 25. In addition, the Kaiser ordered the early return of the High Seas Fleet, which was off the Norwegian coast near Skudenes, 30 nautical miles from Stavanger, and which returned during the course of the 29th July, arrived back in Wilhelmshaven and Kiel. However, this recall was made against the urgent advice of Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, who saw it as an avoidable provocation of Great Britain. However, he was unable to prevail against the Emperor's favorite toy. Wilhelm II arrived in Berlin on July 27. There, he heard about the plan proposed on the same day by British Foreign Minister Lord Edward Grey, which called for the convening of an ambassadors' conference aimed at international mediation. France also now declared its willingness to urge its ally Russia to remain calm, if Berlin would in return persuade Vienna to seek a compromise. But even Paris no longer seemed to have much faith in peace, despite its verbal efforts toward understanding. On July 28th, Berlin received information that France had ordered its troops, who were on maneuvers, back to their barracks, and had also placed important railway facilities and bridges under military guard from that moment on. These measures had already been taken by the French Ministry of War on July 26th at 11 o'clock in the morning, at a time when Wilhelm II was not even in Germany yet, and up to that point, no German mobilization measures of any kind had taken place. Now, however, since every action by the neighbor made similar steps in one's own country, quote, absolutely necessary, end quote, Berlin also ordered, shown here is the War Ministry, on the 29th Bahnhöfe. On July 29th, the recall of all military personnel on leave was ordered, quote, for the implementation of limited security measures, end quote. In Great Britain, however, they did not follow this continental rush job approach, but instead used their pattern that had been tested over centuries by talking about peace while preparing for war. George V still spoke of the possible neutrality of Albion on July 26th, but did nothing against the order of the First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, who ordered the fleet assembled in Portland for a trial mobilization to remain together, even though it was supposed to be demobilized again. In addition to Churchill's measure, the guard ships stationed on the Irish coast received their orders for mobilization. So England was not a model of diplomatic reason in those tense times either, because the deployment of the world's strongest fleet realistically meant nothing less than mobilization for the naval power of Great Britain. But still, no shots were fired. However, an observer increasingly got the impression that the great powers of Europe were now becoming more familiar with the idea of war than ever before. Their negotiations remained far too half-hearted. No decisive steps toward securing peace were visible from any of them. Instead, everyone became suspicious of their neighbor and left it to them to fight with all their might for the preservation of peace, which, of course, did not happen under such circumstances. The Central Powers, and here especially the German Empire, believed themselves to be systematically encircled by the Entente Cordiale through various English, French, and Russian agreements, for which Berlin primarily attributed the responsibility to Great Britain. The reason for what was first called the policy of encirclement in the Reichstag in 1906 was believed to be the rivalry that had existed since 1898 due to the naval laws, which had repeatedly led to German-British disputes. In that year, the German Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz presented his concept for building a German high seas fleet. Nevertheless, these political quarrels should not lead to an overestimation of the German fleet's quotas in relation to the English fleet, because Germany never had even a remotely realistic chance of matching the strength of the home fleet. In addition to the lack of the millions needed for the required new ships, the continental heartland of Europe, with its traditionally strong land forces, was missing even more than that. And what the British Empire thought of the second strongest fleet in the world is made clear by the words of First Sea Lord Churchill, when he said, quote, "The second strongest fleet in the world isn't worth its money in wartime." End of quote. Berlin didn't have problems with France because of its supposedly too large fleet, but for that, the Gallic hearts didn't beat any more fondly toward the Germanic East. The memory of the defeat in 1871 was still too fresh. Here, the entry of German troops into Paris on March 1, 1871, nationalist circles, of which there were more than enough here as well, carried out their ethnic business with constant regularity, making sure that the idea of revenge was never forgotten. However, the German Empire had also, without compelling reason, created a permanent symbol of French military failure for France by annexing Alsace-Lorraine, which, for the overwhelming majority of the French, could only be erased by a victory over the hated Boches. The third member of the Entente Alliance, Russia, Here is the population map of the two alliance systems, supported its position under the banner of Pan-Slavism. The partly militant nationalist movements and currents against the supranational states of Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which would later become Turkey, and thus fueled the previously only smoldering fire of the autonomy efforts of the Slavic tribes. The aforementioned telegram from the Tsar to Belgrade spoke a clear language in this direction, and so did the war preparations since the 26th. July reinforced the impression of Russian involvement. Europe had thus reached a crossroads at this point, where from now on every nation trusted its military steps more than its diplomatic ones. To finally push things over the edge, Austria took action on the 28th of July, creating a new climax in the crisis that just 10 days earlier had not even been recognized as such. At 11 o'clock in the morning, it declared war on Serbia, whose peace army consisted of 52,000 soldiers. In response to this alarming news, an exchange of telegrams in English took place that same evening between the related German Emperor Wilhelm II and the Russian Tsar Nicholas II, which was to continue until August 1. In their correspondence, both monarchs implored each other to exert a moderating influence on their allies and to prevent the worst evil, the looming Great War, if possible. However, there was a completely opposing view between the two regarding the declaration of war by the powerful Austria-Hungary against Little Bosnia. While Wilhelm II defended Vienna, the Tsar spoke of, quote, an unworthy war, end quote, against a weak country. But while the telegraph lines between Berlin and St. Petersburg were running hot, the English fleet, on the evening of the 28th of July, received the order from the Admiralty to reach their battle stations off Scapa Flow. Russia, too, had spent the hours of the 29th of July mobilizing its southern military districts with 55 infantry divisions, despite the intense exchange of telegrams between the rulers. Certainly, this partial mobilization was initially directed against the Danube monarchy. However, it no longer completely ruled out a threat to Germany. Two-thirds of the mobilization area, after all, included European Russia. But it was precisely in this area that the overwhelming majority of reserve formations were assembled, and according to Berlin, not all of them were intended for deployment against Austria. Now, in order to nip all hopes for peace in the bud from the Russian side as well, on the evening of the 29th on July, the ruthless Generalissimo Grand Duke Nikolai Nikolaevich Romanov ordered the general mobilization of Russia. He was one of those who absolutely wanted war against Germany. This also included, among other things, close military cooperation with France. Romanov's goal was the conquest of the Mediterranean Strait, the Dardanelles. But as they said in St. Petersburg, the way to this led through the Brandenburg Gate. Consequently, the German Empire had to be destroyed first, and Austria-Hungary had to be deprived of its protectorate. After that, Vienna's rule over the Balkans could be ended. This would also create the conditions for the destruction of the Ottoman Empire, today's Turkey. And the Dardanelles, controlled by the Turks, would forever be under Russia's authority. However, the Tsar, who had previously been kept unaware of the general mobilization, revoked it at 11 p.m. and turned it back into a nationwide partial mobilization. He was still hoping for a political solution that would make a war with Germany unnecessary. In fact, it seemed that the Serbs were now also willing to comply with the main demands of the ultimatum presented to them by Vienna. As a result, the German Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg sent urgent telegrams to Austria, urging a willingness to negotiate. But there seemed to be hardly any interest there anymore, especially because of the unwavering loyalty to Vienna offered by the German Emperor. Because in the meantime, news had arrived about the first Serbian-Austrian border skirmishes, which on the 28th had taken place on the afternoon and evening of July 28th. There was also further information from France, according to which orders had been issued to set up border defenses, allowing for the deployment of 11 infantry divisions and 10 cavalry divisions, independent of the mobilization which had not yet taken place. Once again, it seemed to the great general staff at Berlin's Königsplatz that Germany could fall behind in terms of timing. In any case, on July 30, the generals in Berlin felt compelled, quote, to play it safe, end quote, and to urge the Minister of War to call up the reservists. But General von Falkenhayn did not comply with this request, which, however, was also supported by Kaiser Wilhelm II, had been supported, but instead only ordered the deployment of border guards on the eastern border. Russia, meanwhile, expanded on the evening of the 30th. In July, it expanded its previous partial mobilization to a general mobilization of all armed forces, whose peacetime strength was 1,499,000 soldiers, and could now quickly draw on around 6 million trained reservists. This general mobilization proved the hawk Nikolai Nikolaevich Romanov's definitive victory over the Tsar, who was basically not anti-German. The Russian Empire had thus crossed the Rubicon. The news from St. Petersburg had arrived at the Great General Staff in Berlin during the night of July 31st through an agent's report. On the same day, at 11:40 in the morning, the official confirmation from the German ambassador in St. Petersburg, Count Portalis, also arrived. Quote, General mobilization, Army and Navy ordered. First day of mobilization, July 31st. End of quote. Around noon on the 31st, he also mobilized Belgium. In addition to the standing army of 48,000 men, about 300,000 reservists were now available. Because of this news, the German emperor ordered at 1 p.m. the, quote, state of imminent danger of war for the territory of the German Empire, end quote, and put border protection on the western border into effect. Just a little later, at 4 p.m., the Council of Ministers in Paris agreed to the demands of Commander-in-Chief Joseph Joffre to call up additional reserves. Hours later, late at night, the decision was made in favor of a French mobilization starting on August 1st at 4 p.m. Off Scapa Flow, the English battleships had meanwhile also taken up their battle stations. But even at this point, a peaceful resolution of the crisis was still possible. In this situation, an extremely harmful action had a very negative effect on further understanding. However, it did fit into Wilhelm II's concept, who had already attracted attention earlier through thoughtless and undiplomatic remarks. Immediately after declaring the state of imminent danger of war, Berlin submitted an ultimatum-like inquiry to St. Petersburg and Paris. They hoped this would finally clarify the situation. Both governments were informed that Germany would also mobilize, quote, unless Russia ceases all military actions against us and Austria-Hungary within 12 hours, and gives us specific assurances about this, end quote. It was added to the French message that mobilization would inevitably mean war. In addition, a secret postscript instructed the German ambassador in Paris, Baron Wilhelm von Schoen, to make a declaration in the event of a French declaration of neutrality. Quote, that as a guarantee for neutrality, we must demand the surrender of the fortresses of Toul and Verdun. End of quote. A deal that was, of course, unacceptable for Paris. Russia was given 12 hours and France 18 hours to respond to the time-limited requests. However, this time passed without St. Petersburg having given a response by the deadline at noon on August 1st. In response, Wilhelm II, still hoping for British neutrality, ordered the general mobilization of the German armed forces starting at 5 p.m. At 7 p.m., he had Ambassador Portalis deliver the declaration of war to Russia in St. Petersburg. Meanwhile, France had already ordered general mobilization at 3:50 p.m. and had Foreign Minister Viviani emphasize, quote, Russia's innocence in the escalation, end quote, which in turn was an affront to Germany. At 6 p.m., the ultimatum issued by Germany was also answered, but only with the telling sentence, quote, "France will do what its interests require." End quote. With this, it now seemed that Paris had also decided on war, especially since it had become known that at 2:15 p.m. an order had been given to the English fleet to proceed according to their mobilization instructions. In this tense European situation, the remaining hours of August 1st passed. August 2nd had been designated as the first day of mobilization for Germany, on which the first military measures began in earnest. From that day on, this also meant the deployment of larger troop contingents to the western border. But now Berlin began to feel uneasy about its own boldness, and serious doubts started to spread. In the end, wasn't there a risk that this deployment against France would squander the last chances for a peaceful solution, which many still hoped for? The German ambassador in London, Max Fürst von Lichnowsky, believed, based on English statements, that war could still be limited to the east if Germany committed to refraining from attacking France. After he reported this to Berlin, Wilhelm II and Chancellor von Bethmann-Hollweg were also willing to accept this proposal, but in turn made it a condition that England guarantee France's neutrality. The German army, the Kaiser declared, would in this case march east against Russia instead of against France. However, there were no further foreign policy steps, because now, in these hours before the outbreak of war, so-called military necessities outweighed diplomatic reasoning. The generals pushed for speed. Chief of the General Staff, von Moltke, reported to his supreme commander that a change in deployment was no longer feasible at this point if total chaos was to be avoided. Consequently, the deployment against France would first have to proceed and be more or less completed. Then, however, and this was certainly possible, a new transport movement could be carried out, this time to the east. But, in their statement regarding the deployment to the west and the impossibility of stopping it again, the generals had stretched the truth. Because at the time of the proposed change of march to the east, instead of the west, on the 1st of the month, on the 1st of August, at least the deployment could have been stopped, although at the risk of a 2-day delay. But now, a legal regulation became increasingly important, namely, the Law on War Contributions from the 13th. January 1873, which had established the obligations of the railway to transport the armed forces and their needs. The attached military railway regulations governed the cooperation between the civil and military authorities, the so-called Railway Department of the Great General Staff. However, its officers had predicted great chaos in the event that the deployment was halted. Thus, it happened that chaos was prevented by continuing the operation, but at the cost of an orderly entry into the war. Within a few days, the deployment of the Western Army moved along 13 independent double-track transport routes leading to the assembly areas of the troops. In total, at the beginning of the war, 11,100 military transports carrying about 3,120 soldiers and 860,000 horses were conducted on German railways without disruptions or accidents. That was a remarkable achievement at the time. For example, during the period from the 2nd to the 18th, the Cologne-Hohenzollern Bridge experienced this. In August, about 2,150 trains headed west, which means one every 10 minutes. But precisely because of this proverbial organizational ability of the Prussian-German civil service, which was so clearly demonstrated, the objection of the General Staff, which had predicted chaos when redirecting the deployment, is hard to maintain. In the worst case, slowing down the transports would have caused a complete collapse of civilian rail traffic, which had already been almost entirely restricted on the main lines anyway. The further difficulty of supplying people and livestock in the stationary trains could at least have been adequately solved by bringing food and fodder from the villages along the railway lines. However, these considerations soon became unnecessary, as the deployment to the west took place as planned. Furthermore, in retrospect, it is also questionable whether a halt in troop movements would have led to any political success at all. Because even England, which was relatively safe due to its island location, was not willing to guarantee its neutrality, even in the event of a German guarantee of Belgian neutrality. But it was precisely the violation of Belgium's neutrality that was to be the reason Great Britain went to war. Because after reports of French border violations had now also reached the Great General Staff in Berlin, which, however, had not been ordered by the French military leadership. The German measures to occupy Luxembourg and to march through Belgium to reach the troop assembly areas on the French border continued. Brussels, which had received a German inquiry regarding its stance on such a German action, immediately informed Germany that it would oppose any violation of its neutrality with force. Great Britain, as one of the signatories of Belgian independence in 1839, ordered on the 2nd. On August 2nd at 2:45 in the morning, the practically already completed mobilization of the Grand Fleet was ordered, which meant that here, too, the die had been cast. One day later, on August 3rd at 6 o'clock, PM Ambassador Schoen in Paris delivered, quote, "Due to ongoing border violations," end quote, the German declaration of war to France. While King Albert I of Belgium was still insisting on maintaining the sovereignty of his country, on the 4th. On the morning of August 4th, German troops entered Belgium without a declaration of war, but, as they put it, quote, "for self-preservation," end quote. The Treaty of 1839, which had guaranteed the neutrality of this small country located between Germany and France for 75 years, was now worth no more than the paper on which its articles had been printed. Indeed, Wilhelm II still hoped, despite Germany's violation of international law, that the two countries could still reach an amicable settlement. But on the evening of the 4th August, Brussels broke off diplomatic relations with Berlin. At the same time, England issued an ultimatum demanding a satisfactory explanation from Germany regarding the restoration and preservation of Belgian neutrality, but was unsuccessful in its request. From then on, England used this violation of neutrality for its anti-German propaganda, which spread even to the USA and paved the way there for later entry into the war. In Berlin, the term Nibelung loyalty to Austria-Hungary increasingly became an excuse-making slogan for all politicians. Only a few wanted to understand that, because of the neutrality guarantee it had given, England had to take active measures, even if it became a political blunder. In contrast, Belgium was largely insignificant in many respects for many political and military leaders in Germany. It went so far that Berlin cynically promised this so-called subordinate nation generous compensation for the period of occupation. Therefore, it is not surprising that Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg was in Berlin on July 4th, wanted to know from the British ambassador Sir Edward Goschen why the related nation was going to war over a so-called scrap of paper, who also wanted to go to war with Germany over the Treaty on Belgium's neutrality, which had been signed by Prussia. Britain's answer came the next day, because as the last major European power, it declared on the 5th of August war on the German Empire, which, due to the colonial expansion of the empire, shown here in red, was from then on called a world war.